The takeoff stage of economic development, according to Ristow, is really the key stage of economic development. So, you'll see that the text is highlighted here. That's to indicate the importance of this stage in particular. So, take note. Often when people are discussing Ristow, which happens all the time, I meet people constantly who are discussing Ristow's stages of economic. I'm just kidding, of course not. But if Ristow's theory is discussed, you often what you do hear discussed is the takeoff stage, and in fact, the takeoff stage is really kind of crossed over into popular culture and popular discourse. So you'll see it mentioned kind of casually in journalistic pieces and other forms of popular media to describe a really kind of dynamic economy, and an economy that has really transitioned from the traditional and transitional stage, the kind of more basic stages of economic development, to achieve a much more kind of dynamic and aggressive form of economic development. So the takeoff stage is kind of named after the, of course, process by which airplanes are able to transition from the ground, from the earth to the sky, which is called the takeoff. And so here you see a Boeing 737, taking off. And of course, the takeoff stage is, a stage where the economy really starts to ramp up in terms of economic development and the benefits of that economic development. So this is a stage where industrialization starts to materialize. You start to see factories, you start to see kind of more mechanization in agriculture, systematized ways of extracting resources and potentially even converting those resources into consumer goods and consumer durables. This is a stage where there's lots of investment. So today, contemporarily, I think, and even historically, many nations that achieve takeoff are doing so via external investments. So these could be large infusions of capital from other nation states, like, say, the United States or China, but also from international lending agencies like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other kind of smaller international lending agencies, maybe the China Exim Bank or the Asia Infrastructure Bank. All of these are in the business of distributing capital to countries that lack capital and are, at least at face value or for PR purposes, meant to promote economic development. The reality could be a bit different than that, and we'll explore that in a bit more detail with dependency theory. You start to see regional growth. So many poor countries kind of suffer from this kind of clustering of economic growth and resources in a single metropolitan area. So in many cases, this is the capital, not always, and actually sometimes you see countries actually changing their capital and kind of moving to less developed regions in order to attract investment and potentially promote regional growth. So Nigeria, did this when they moved their capital city from Lagos into the north to Kano, and this was done for various reasons. There were ethnic and sectarian kind of dynamics and other political compromises, but one of them is to kind of more widely distribute economic growth throughout the nation. But nevertheless, many countries in the traditional or transitional stage still maybe only have one major city that has achieved a significant level of economic growth, and the regions are often starved of capital, and there's a big inequality between the major metropolitan area and the outlying regions. So the takeoff stage is a more kind of diverse form of economic growth. There's political change, so you could see a shift towards more democratic modes of governance. That's not necessarily always true, and in fact, many nations kind of take a different tact, and you could even see authoritarianism increase as a result of achieving takeoff stage. And rising incomes. So per capita incomes tend to increase during this period. And per capita income is a good variable to look at when we want to think about macroeconomic development in a nation state. It doesn't tell us anything about increases in poverty or increases in inequality. It's an average income essentially of citizens within a nation state. But nevertheless, incomes do rise. The takeoff stage is unique in that it involves a kind of qualitative change in patterns of economic growth. So in the takeoff stage, growth shifts from a kind of linear, predictable, positive growth pattern, or maybe even stagnant or flat kind of growth, to exponential economic growth. So growth really starts to ramp up and starts to accrue much more rapidly in the takeoff stage. The takeoff stage is not easy to achieve. This is the kind of overall goal of modernization theory, is to provide a template for poor countries to achieve economic development. That's no easy feat. If it were easy, I think many more countries would be much wealthier than they are today. Would have at least higher per capita incomes and greater GDPs, gross domestic product, the size of their economy would be larger. But the takeoff stage requires fundamental reform, and I don't think I can stress the word fundamental enough here. So we're talking about basic structural changes to the economy, to the political system, and potentially to society itself that, as I mentioned previously, can be disruptive, can displace whole population groups, including elites, and can upend power structures, upend power dynamics significantly. So, there are a lot of reasons, actually, why a poor country would really not achieve the takeoff stage, or not even attempt to achieve the takeoff stage, because maybe the cost is considered too high. So next we're going to discuss here the preconditions for achieving takeoff. I say preconditions for development, but really what we're talking about here is preconditions for achieving the takeoff stage. So these are those political, economic, and social reforms, or at least some of them, that a nation would need to implement in order to achieve the takeoff stage. Now, I mentioned that modernization theory is a liberal economic theory, meaning that it is really interested in free markets and not so interested in government intervention or a large state, a large public sector. So the first reform, and keep in mind that as we go through these reforms, you'll notice that many of them kind of overlap and are linked with one another. So I apologize if there's some redundancy in this segment. But the first reform is privatization. So privatization involves a kind of transferring of services and industry to private interests. So this might involve the privatization of the criminal justice system. So in the U.S., about 10% of prisons are operated by private corporations. So that's an example of transferring what's normally considered a kind of public service, incarceration, I guess you can call that a service, to private interests. But this might also involve the privatization of transportation, education, and really any other kind of service or industry that you can imagine. So many poor countries, have industries that are rarely, if ever, controlled by public interests, such as maybe a garment industry or an electronics industry or an automobile industry. In developed nations or in rich countries, that might be in fact controlled by public interests in a poor country or a less developed nation. So privatization is key here, transferring ownership to private interests, which according to modernization theorists, increases efficiency and increases productivity, by kind of incentivizing greater productivity through financial rewards. So the second reform that I'd like to discuss is called austerity. So austerity involves a reduction in government expenditure. So this includes kind of slashing social welfare programs, maybe cutting education budgets, cutting health budgets, really, cutting what might be considered excess spending. To a modernization theorist, a proponent, of modernization theory. And, of course, this can be quite harmful to the folks that rely upon, public largesse who, survive by accessing social welfare, who might benefit from public education, who might, benefit from a universal healthcare system. Those costs are considered inefficient. They're considered kind of, an unnecessary burden on the state, and they should be reduced according to modernization theory. So I don't know if anyone was following some of the discussions around austerity measures that were imposed upon Greece in maybe 2014, 2015, 2016, and the social unrest that that followed. So many citizens of Greece were not so happy that their benefits were being slashed, their pensions were being slashed, and they came out to protest those austerity measures that were imposed by the European Union. Free markets. So this, of course, relates to privatization. It also relates to austerity because government spending can actually kind of interfere with the market, according to modernization theorists. And so modernization theorists are going to argue that promoting free markets and reducing government influence is really paramount to achieving the takeoff stage. Deregulating industry, deregulating finance. So regulation is kind of seen by proponents of free markets, liberal economists, and modernization theorists as barriers to economic growth and dynamism. I don't think that modernization theorists are calling for a complete deregulation of all industry and a removal of all environmental regulations and financial regulations, but reducing them certainly and streamlining them would be a kind of position that would be advocated by modernization theorists. Essentially creating a more business-friendly environment, right? So, lowering overhead for businesses by removing regulations that they might have to conform to or adhere to in order to operate. Next, we have a reduction of trade barriers. So, just kind of going back to promoting the free market, reducing trade barriers. This would include kind of lowering import tariffs, lowering export tariffs as well, really reducing kind of friction in trade between nation states. So multilateral trade agreements, such as the World Trade Organization, or NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, these kind of newer agreements, the Asia Pacific Trade Agreement. These are examples of kind of platforms that would be supported by modernization theory, a kind of global interconnectedness, and not only that, but really exposing local industries to global competition. This, according to modernization theory, would kind of result in changes to practices of local industries that would make them more competitive on a global scale, and also would eliminate non-competitive firms, right? Kind of push them out of the market, almost a kind of Darwinian survival of the fittest kind of environment. And finally, I want to talk about a more specific precondition, which is, and this is, a kind of well documented and developed strategy that many poor countries have used and still are using to achieve economic development. And this is called export-led industrialization, sometimes abbreviated as ELI. And ELI says that nations should utilize their comparative advantage. So nations or regions should really focus on producing whatever they can produce, whether that's a good, a natural resource, or a service at the lowest cost possible, the most kind of, what they're most efficient at, they should focus on. So this could be natural resources, this could be light manufacturing, could be metals, could be electronic products, could be agricultural products, could be outsourcing services. So India, for instance, has become a major destination for the outsourcing of IT services, and this is one kind of example of an export essentially. That India kind of exports their IT expertise around the globe. But this example here is referencing South Korea, which did adopt export-led industrialization, was probably one of the earliest nations to adopt export-led industrialization and really implement reforms associated with modernization theory aggressively. And South Korea, as you might be aware, is considered a kind of economic miracle. So probably the most rapid case of economic development in recent history, and maybe in all of history, for a large-scale state at least. So back in 1960, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world and had annual export values of US 87 million. I should have a citation here. This is from the World Bank. And in 2016, export values totaled 537 billion. So you have this, just exponential change, right, in the values of exports. And of course, South Korea has relied heavily upon, at least initially, exporting semiconductors and light kind of electronic goods. And today is one of the world's leading manufacturers of advanced electronics. So it's moved out of this kind of light manufacturing into a much more kind of advanced manufacturing phase. And part of export-led industrialization involves the establishment of what are referred to as special export zones. These are abbreviated as SEZs. So I know we have a lot of acronyms here. We have ELI and SEZs. You don't need to necessarily remember all of these acronyms, but I did want to provide them here for your edification. So special export zones are a kind of method of achieving export-led industrialization without maybe making fundamental reforms to an entire nation state or an entire political system or an entire economy. So these are economic development zones within a nation that operate under distinct laws and regulations, often with a focus on attracting global corporations and global capital. So China has used this model incredibly effectively. Similarly to South Korea, China has experienced a phenomenal economic growth in the past 40 years, 50 years, and particularly in the last 30 years has really seen its economy kind of qualitatively change, right? And so this was achieved at least in part by using special export zones, the first of which was established in the southern port city of Shenzhen in the Guangdong province. The Shenzhen SEZ was then followed by, I think China now has 8 or 9 SEZ zones, which are quite large. So these were kind of replicated throughout China, primarily in eastern kind of coastal regions, but also we do see some SEZs in central China and western China. And Shenzhen, going back to 1980, was an area with a relatively small population. About 300,000 people lived in what's called Shenzhen today. The 2000 census in Shenzhen showed that there were over 4 million people. Probably today there are many more than that. I haven't seen the most recent numbers. Sometimes population data is hard to come by from China. But Shenzhen is one of the largest, part of one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, and has experienced kind of unimaginable economic growth as a result of its establishment as special export zones. So special export zones are places with very low regulation, very low trade barriers, maybe don't kind of utilize some of the labor laws that the broader nation state does. And, with this lack of regulation and with these kind of distinct laws and rules that exist, they're able to attract global capital and able to kind of engage in this export-led industrialization. So producing, in China at least, kind of light manufactured goods. So this was really the era that preceded China becoming the world's kind of global workshop, right? And so these special export zones were used to as a catalyst towards that. Okay, so just to wrap up here, the takeoff stage is definitely associated with significant economic growth. It is a stage that has absolutely produced economic growth, and I'm going to show you an example here. So just give me one moment. Okay. So you should be seeing here some data on, let me move myself a bit, on GDP per capita. These are from the World Development Indicators that are provided by Google, just a really cool tool for doing data visualizations. And so we're seeing GDP per capita, which is the total, of course, gross domestic product of a nation divided by each citizen, or the population size. This is done in current US dollars. So it gives us a kind of, today's representation of the size of these economies. And looking at these data, I have a few selected nation states, and we can kind of compare countries that implemented modernization reforms and particularly used ELI, and nations that didn't, and look at some of the differences in economic growth over in some cases the last 60 years. So first off, I have Korea. You'll see that going back to 1960, the GDP per capita is pretty low, 158.21. That's very low, quite low. But all of our nations essentially are starting around that starting point. Throughout the 1960s, you see not a lot of growth. So maybe we're calling this the traditional and maybe even transitional stage. But by the early 1980s, growth starts to ramp up. By the late 1980s, we're getting significant income growth. And that continues on this kind of exponential growth pattern with, of course, some volatility until 2018, when we're at a GDP per capita that is on par with some of the wealthiest countries in the world. So South Korea moves from being one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world in the span of about 40 years, which is just incredible and unprecedented. If we compare South Korea with Vietnam, and Vietnam, of course, did have a communist revolution. It certainly rejected modernization theory and adopted a very different path of economic development. And we do see that starting in 1985, per capita GDP is pretty similar to South Korea's back in 1960. And we do have to keep in mind the context. So there were over 3.5 million Vietnamese citizens who were killed during the conflict. This devastated the economy. This devastated people's lives, and so of course we can't expect Vietnam to have kind of fully recovered by 1985 from a conflict that didn't really cease until 1979. So we do have to consider the context, but Vietnam is here, 231. We see throughout the 1980s, there's a bit of kind of fluctuation up and down. Certain points are kind of more favorable than others, but we don't see a lot of GDP growth. And it's not until really the early 2000s that we start to see moderate GDP growth. And even then, Vietnam still has, very low GDP per capita compared with South Korea. So this isn't a perfect, kind of analysis here, but it does show you some of the differences in economic trajectory between states that adopted modernization-oriented policies and states that did not. I have Chile and Cuba. I won't go through the same kind of historical analysis, but these are Latin American states, both of them. Chile adopted modernization theory in the mid-1970s, early 1980s. Cuba did not, and they have taken significantly different kind of pathways in terms of economic development, with Cuba still having a relatively low per capita income, or GDP per capita, sorry, and Chile having one of the highest in Latin America, and one of the higher GDP per capitas globally. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are costs to achieving the takeoff stage, and these costs are associated with the reforms that need to be implemented in order to do so. One of these is increased authoritarianism. So in the cases of both South Korea and Chile, the modernization aligned reforms were paired with authoritarian regimes. So you had the Park Chung-hee regime in South Korea that implemented these economic reforms that resulted in incredible economic growth, but this, was achieved through the use of political repression, the jailing of dissidents, poverty increased, there was starvation, inequality expanded. This is true not only in South Korea, but also in Chile, which also had a military dictatorship under Pinochet. During the period of modernization-oriented reforms. Unemployment, this largely is a result of austerity measures and decline in public sector employment. Politics become polarized, so you have this particularly class divides in politics that start to characterize the ideological divide. Social instability, so there could be protests, and there were many in Chile and in South Korea. Many of them, were dealt with in a heavy-handed way with security forces. And so, the takeoff stage absolutely produces economic growth. It does raise living standards, at least on aggregate, but there are many who suffer.